Thank you all so much for joining us. I hope everyone had a wonderful break. Right before we get started, I am going to hand it over to Barbara for some Spanish translation instructions.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Barbara, and alongside my co-interpreter for today, Selena, will be providing simultaneous interpretation into Spanish. I'll be making this announcement bilingual, and then we'll start the simultaneous interpretation. Entonces, hola a todos. Mi nombre es Bárbara y junto con mi cointérprete Selena hoy vamos a estar proveyendo interpretación simultánea del inglés al español. I'm going to review real quickly how to access the equipment and then some ground rules on how to make sure that we're working best together. Entonces voy a repasar brevemente cómo acceder al equipo y también unas reglas básicas para que podamos interactuar de la mejor forma posible con la interpretación. So if y'all are joining from your laptop, you'll see on the Zoom toolbar on the bottom right-hand corner a globe icon that says interpretation. Please click on there and select the language you want to hear this conversation in. Si se están uniendo de su computadora personal o una computadora en general, van a ver una barra de herramientas en la parte inferior derecha de su pantalla. Van a ver un icono de un globo terráqueo que dice interpretación. Por favor, hagan clic ahí y seleccionen el idioma que quieren escuchar esta conversación. If you're joining from your cell phone, at the bottom right-hand corner, you're going to see 3 dots that say more. Click on there, and there you'll get the option for language interpretation, and you could access the options for how to listen to this conversation. Si se están uniendo de su celular, en la parte inferior derecha van a ver un icono de 3 puntos que dice más o more. Ahí le hacen clic y van a ver la opción para interpretación y pueden elegir cómo quieren escuchar esta conversación. Just some ground rules. Please remember to speak one person at a time, to keep your microphone muted when you're not speaking, and to please speak slowly and with pause. I know we're really passionate about these issues and sometimes we speak very quickly, so please remember to take a breath in between sentences. Entonces quería recordarles algunas reglas básicas de cómo interactuar con el equipo. Por favor, recuerden hablar una persona a la vez, mantener su micrófono en mudo si no están hablando. Y por favor, hablen lentamente y con pausa, así podemos capturar todo lo que se está diciendo. And lastly, if you're having any issues, please let us know in the chat and we'll try to help you out as best as we can. Also for speakers, please look out on the chat. That's how we'll be reminding you if we need you to please slow down. Entonces, para las personas que tengan algún problema técnico o tengan alguna pregunta sobre la interpretación, por favor, déjenos saber en el chat. Y un recordatorio a las personas que van a estar presentando hoy que por favor estén pendientes del chat si les estamos pidiendo que por favor reduzcan la velocidad de cómo están hablando. Y'all should be able to access and hear the interpretation right now. If you're having any issues, please let us know. And please assign me as interpreter like that. I can help out Selena. Thank you very much.
And I'm guessing with that, we'll get started. Does that sound good for everyone? Great. Hi, it is so lovely to be here with you all. We're here today from the Office of Transgender Initiatives with our other TAC representatives to bring this to you. This session is called Getting a Seat at the Table, Lessons and Strategies from San Francisco's Transgender Advocacy Week. We're so excited to be here. Next, please. And so we'll get started with some introductions. So hi, my name is Zaldivar. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the manager of training and education at the Office of Transgender Initiatives. I'll go ahead and pass it to Pau.
Hi, everyone. My name is Pau Crego. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the executive director of the Office of Transgender Initiatives in San Francisco. Khilynn.
Good morning. My name is Khilynn Fowler. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the manager of community engagements with the Office of Transgender Initiatives.
Joaquin.
Hi, everyone. My name is Joaquin Remora. My pronouns are he and him. I'm the Director of Housing for our Trans Home SF.
And a member of our Trans Advisory Committee. And then Nicole.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Nicole Santamaria. I go by she and we pronouns, and I am the Executive Director for ELA para Trans Latina, and I'm transitioning out from the Trans Advisory Committee.
Thank you, everyone. So these are the folks you're going to hear from today. You see our agenda here. We'll go a little bit over what the TAC is, the Transgender Advisory Committee, and some of the work we do here at OTI. We'll learn a bit about what we do with Advocacy Week, the accomplishments, the process, and then we'll provide some tips on how you can start this sort of activism in your communities and share some of the lessons we've learned along the way. Next, please. Alrighty, so just a little bit about us and the work we do here at OTI. You'll see the mural in our slide there. I'm also here in the office, happy to be back. So what we do with the Office of Transgender Initiatives is that we focus on trans issues, and we also do a lot of broader LGBTQ work as well to move our community forward. We were one of the first trans-led government offices, and we work directly with community in different ways so we can ensure that trans people don't get left behind and can be a part of the communities we serve. Next slide, please. So these are the different areas that OTI focuses on. We advise the mayor's office and different city departments. What that looks like is providing different suggestions and ideas of how to incorporate our community, how to serve our community respectfully, how to lift us up. Training and education, I do that. I go to different city departments and do trans 101s and sort of educate the different offices of how they can serve trans clients or work with trans coworkers. Policy and programs, we've had incredible work of just implementing policies that protect trans people, like the gender inclusion policy that applies to all city employees. And civic and community engagement, that's what we're going to learn a bit about today, is how we've engaged with our community in order to hear the needs of our community and lift them up. Next slide, please. So with that, one of the big ways that we collaborate with our community is with the Transgender Advisory Committee. Now, this committee is comprised of different trans leaders in San Francisco, and those leaders serve the trans communities in different ways. Like you heard from Nicole, an executive director for ELA para Trans Latinas. We've been able to have her voice a part of this group of trans leaders. We have Joaquin here. I used to be a TAC member. So what it was just a collection of leaders that represent a variety of sectors to discuss the needs of our community. The reality is when TAC was first developed, we were a bit unsure of what we would accomplish. We had a bunch of leaders together. This office was brand new. And we were trying to think of the different ways we could really put our personal and professional experience together in order to accomplish something. So what we did is we brainstormed of all the different things we could accomplish, and that led to the then inception of Transgender Advocacy Week, which is what we're going to talk about today. I want to take a pause here and just acknowledge Joaquin and Nicole. I'll start with a question for Joaquin. Why did you want to join the TAC?
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Shane. I was a new director and, really wanted to be able to make sure that our services with other trans organizations were working in tandem, since we serve a lot of the same population. Without housing, healthcare is less effective. And so we, wanted to be in good relationship with our colleagues in other organizations, as well as for the opportunity to learn more about how everything works and advocacy season works. And so I was able to learn all that through the program, through the tech. Yeah.
Thank you, Joaquin. And Nicole, I'll ask you, what has it been like to work with other local trans leaders on this committee?
Thank you, Shane. Well, it's a very richful experience, you know, because I have always believed that collective liberation should be performed by the trans leaders and the trans people who are in the root of the organization, you know, direct servicing the community. So working side by side with amazing leaders with from all generations, I think that makes this experience very rich.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Yeah, and I've really enjoyed the experience myself. Like, I started off as a former TAC member before I started my work with OTI, and it was a really incredible way to sort of invigorate knowledge and power in what was possible and what we could achieve when we kind of come together. And it's been a great journey to kind of see what we started off with. Like I said, at first, we didn't kind of know what we would do. But then that led to the brainstorming of Advocacy Week, which we'll talk about next. Thank you both. Next slide, please. So Trans Advocacy Week, we're going to talk about now the purpose of it, the accomplishments, and kind of the process of how we got to it and the process of sort of how we make it happen. We have a quote here by Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm, I don't want to say it incorrectly, but if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. And this was a bit of our motivation to start Advocacy Week, right? Like, a lot of times our voices don't get heard, so we wanted to make a point to make them heard. So next slide, please. So I'll just read this verbatim for the sake of sort of defining Advocacy Week. So Transgender Advocacy Week is a week during which the San Francisco Transgender Advisory Committee, the TAC, and our office, OTI, meet with the mayor and the Board of Supervisors to present budget and policy recommendations to the city, for the city, to better support our communities during the city budget process. So this might sound simple in definition, but how did this really come about? You know, you'll see a picture here of, this was our first Advocacy Week when we were in person back in 2019. We were all gearing up to meet our elected officials, and it was an exciting day. But let's talk a bit more about how we came to Trans Advocacy Week. Next slide, please. So like I said, when we first brought this group together, the TAC, we brainstormed and brought our professional and personal experiences to a drawing board, right? And we know the problem that government has historically not taken care of the needs of trans people. So we wanted to make sure that the systems and institutions that everybody needs to access in order to navigate and move forward in life, that trans people could have access to that as well. Because we know that in the world we live in, the consequences of that essential problem is systemic discrimination, inequities, and different hardships that trans people experience on the daily, you know, trying to access their basic needs. But we know even through data, you know, that trans people have a hard time navigating, and we wanted to lift up those voices and experiences in order to create a change. So our solution was Advocacy Week, Transgender Advocacy Week. We wanted to find a way to advocate for our community through programs and services that could be made whole, to ensure that our community is not left behind, and also to create something for us and by us. And we thought through Advocacy Week that we could hold our elected officials accountable to the communities that they're serving. And so next slide, please. So when this started off, this was back in 2019. We were really doing this for the first time, and we had to put this idea into practice. We wanted to focus on the most important things that could immediately impact the well-being of our community. And so the first thing we wanted to focus on in 2019 was housing. We crafted recommendations, and we did that with the help and support of our full TAC. Everybody kind of narrowed our recommendations to 3 talking points you'll see here. So back in 2019, we wanted to provide rental subsidies to the transgender and gender nonconforming folks of the city. We wanted to increase trans and gender nonconforming inclusion and safety in shelters. And we wanted to establish a dedicated trans and gender nonconforming housing program for our community. Back then, we had to schedule all of our meetings in one day. And I just remember us running back and forth to different city offices in order to have those meetings held. But the way it worked is that we shared these recommendations to those elected officials in the meetings. And we got to speak about how these sort of programs could really improve the lives of our trans community in the city. And so what that led to after we had those conversations was an investment from the city, which was $1 million a year to launch our Trans Home SF. So this was a major accomplishment. We really went into this not knowing what the outcome would be. We wanted to see if our officials would really hear us out and invest in our well-being. So once that happened and we had the success of 2019, what we did then is put our attention to making it happen all over again. So in 2020, we shifted our focus into making sure that certain services were funded. We wanted to make sure that we could redirect funding to support our BIPOC and low-income trans communities. And we wanted to ensure that there was relief and recovery in the pandemic. So once again, we had another investment that year from the city to ensure the stability of Lyon Martin Community Health. And that is a really essential service to our trans community here in San Francisco because it's a trans-focused, trans-led healthcare that our city community members can access. And so here you'll see how that timeline has kind of gone through the years, right? In 2001, we wanted to focus on investing in trans well-being. We wanted to expand services, and we wanted to try to get an income pilot going. The city once again listened to us, heard us out, and was able to make an investment. And in 2022, just this past year, we were able to get a commitment from the mayor to invest $4 million a year towards ending trans homelessness by 2027. So you'll see here how this timeline works. We really try to focus in on 3 recommendations and speak to our experiences, share data as to why this is important. And over the timeline, we've been able to make some major achievements. Next slide, please. So here are the accomplishments again, and this is all to say that Trans Advocacy Week, as we learned doing this process, is extremely powerful and effective. And the TAC is sort of the driving force of this, right? We as the Office of Transgender Initiatives provide a space for the group to meet and for folks to kind of talk about what's going on in their different sectors, but collectively we're able to sort of focus in on the real problems that we can try to change on an annual basis, right? By initiating these programs, by sharing these recommendations. And year after year, we've been able to build relationships with our elected officials, and we've been able to get some serious investments in the community. And it's been such an amazing thing to be proud of. You know, I know there's a lot of fight in the world right now to just uplift trans community. And this has just been some major success on our end that we're hoping to share with you all today. I want to take a pause and just acknowledge the TAC members in the room. I'll start with Nicole. How have these accomplishments over the past years with Transgender Advocacy Week sort of impacted the orgs or excuse me, impacted your organization or impacted your participants?
Well, I will say that, coming in this state of emergency that the world has been, with the pandemic of COVID, the being able to shift the Trans Advisory Committee in the Trans Advisory Week and the way that we have been approaching the needs that has been shifting as well inside of our communities has impacted for good, not only my organization. I think that in general speaking, the rest of the organizations, because as I mentioned, collective liberation should come from the collectiveness. For example, that Lion Martin has been able to stay, operating and stay open, has impacted for good the rest of the trans and gender diverse communities here in the city of San Francisco. We have been able to access to COVID, vaccines through them. Now the MPOX as well has been redirecting with these other organizations and being able to work in collaborative partnerships with the rest of the trans and gender diverse organizations represented in the TAC has been a deep impact for good for our communities.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And I'll ask you the same question, Joaquin. We've had these different accomplishments. What has it looked like? Have you seen some of that impact your participants or the work that you do?
Yes, thank you. And I totally agree. Thanks, Nicole, about the collective liberation, because the way I look at it and from my perspective is like, I went from being unhoused, and thanks to the work of the Trans Advisory Committee, I was able to get a job as the director of this housing program. From I was a provider, became a client essentially, and then was able to come back to being a provider and kind of hit the ground running with this program. But having that employment really allowed, not just for me, but for a lot of other people that I have now employed who are trans, to kind of be able to take matters into their own hands as far as how to take care of the community and our survival. So now we can get paid and pay our bills to do the things that we were always doing anyway, kind of thing. Because my mentor brought trans people into her house, such as myself. But now essentially we have all this employment opportunity for trans people to survive and also take care of their community. Sorry. And yeah, so it's been phenomenal. And then, one thing leads to the next. So first the house, then the shelter, and then the trans homelessness ask. So what I've learned is you can really keep coming back each year and take kind of the seed that you planted and then harvest it into something greater to kind of make a difference for the future of people's lives. And that's really what we've been able to accomplish with all of the Trans Advisory Committee, which is huge because we're making history and this is the first in the country. So it's a really important strategy. Thanks for all your work.
Thank you, Joaquin and Nicole. And yeah, I think it's just been really incredible. Before I pass it on, I just want to say it's been so moving to see how our voices and experiences can really come to the table and influence change. And we've seen how the different investments and programs have really definitely taken time to build out, but once established have really been a resource to community. And we are just so excited to share how you can make that possible in your hometown. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Pau Crego, our executive director. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Shane. Khilynn, can we move to the next slide? So in this next section, we're going to talk about some key kind of tools and lessons that we want to share with you for you to apply some of what we've learned in the past 4 years and start a Trans Advocacy Week or something similar in your community. Next slide. So we've identified kind of 4 steps to create something like an advocacy week. So we'll go into these 4 steps more in depth in the next few slides, but basically the 4 steps are identifying the problem, developing the necessary relationships, creating a proposal, and then intervening strategically. Next slide. So in terms of identifying the problem, some of the things that we have seen have been super helpful for us are, when we speak to elected officials, we want to create a good balance of providing data to be able to show that the issues that we're talking about are not just kind of individual to one person or a few people in our community, but that this is like a widespread issue, a widespread inequity in our community. So compiling that data really helps document how serious of an issue this is for our community. And then one thing that is a challenge, but as much as possible is really helpful, is to be very specific with regards to how the issues impact different subpopulations, the geographic location, and any gaps in the existing services or funding. So for example, for us, it was important to, as much as possible, find data that was specific to San Francisco residents or people who receive services in San Francisco. And we haven't done a great job about that in the sense that there isn't a lot of data available, but as best you can, and using kind of the closest thing you can is just really helpful to be able to paint that picture to elected officials. The second step is develop or deepen relationships in order to kind of communicate what the problem is. So on the one hand, kind of bringing together a group of community leaders who want to make change. And for us, that was our advisory, the Trans Advisory Committee. And then the second is getting to know your elected officials. So not just who they are, but what they care about, what type of power they have to be able to make a difference, and what their constituency is. So for us, for example, in San Francisco, we have the mayor who has the entire city as her constituency, but then we also have our board of supervisors, which is the equivalent of a city council, and each district has their own supervisor. So those supervisors really care about their specific district. And then the mayor really cares kind of overall, right? So that information was really helpful for us as we went into Trans Advocacy Week. Next slide. The third step for us was creating a proposal. And Shane has gone over a little bit of what that looked like, right? So for us, we kind of boiled it down to the top 3 issues each year that we wanted to advocate for, and developed a concrete proposal that would help address those issues. So for example, even though we have those 3 recommendations every year, we usually have one of those that we develop more in depth. And Khilynn is going to put in the chat, or has already put in the chat, the link to the to our Google Drive folder. And there you can see, for example, what our first detailed proposal looked like to advocate for the Our Trans Home SF program, which now is a reality and has grown over the years. But basically really making sure that in addition to these broad statements and recommendations, there's something concrete that we can point to our elected officials in terms of this is feasible, this is appealing, and this is how you do it and how much it costs, because budget is always obviously a really big concern for elected officials. The fourth step is intervening strategically. So it's really important to learn about the policy and budget processes of your local government and identify when and with whom it makes sense to intervene to be most effective. So we'll talk a little bit soon about what that looked like for us, but basically really making sure that you know what is their power, when they have power, because they might not have the same power throughout the entire year, especially as it relates to budget. And then what if these elected officials want out of this, right? What would they get out of really kind of making our trans home, for example, a reality? And we'll talk a little bit more in the next few slides about that. Okay, next slide. So another thing we wanted to share with you is just kind of what it looks like in practice. So we work on Trans Advocacy Week and preparing pretty much all year round at this point, because we find that it's such a useful tool for our communities, and we found that it's effective. So we really put in the time to prepare as we lead up to April, which is when we do our advocacy week. So in addition to preparing the recommendations and everything like that, we kind of make sure that we have everything really tightened up in terms of what the meetings with elected officials will look like, making sure that we have a schedule of meeting with each of the elected officials within that 1 week. And often that also means rescheduling a lot, right? Because elected officials are busy. So we often are like having to reschedule at the last minute, but making sure that our advisory committee members are aware of that and kind of plan for that week to be as protected as possible in terms of their time really helps us be flexible and then really be able to meet with all of the elected officials. And then what I'll share also about this slide is you'll notice that the most of the time that we spend with the elected officials is usually about sharing stories. And this is a really core piece of the meeting because in addition to providing data, we really want to remind elected officials of the lived experiences of people in our community, right? Like really seeing and talking to real people who have experienced this or know people who have experienced these issues so that they can be grounded in that reality and not forget it and just think about this as a vague issue. So with that in mind, I want to kind of bring Nicole and Joaquin again to tell us a little bit about their experience. And so I'll start with Joaquin. And I want to ask you, Joaquin, what has it been like for you to have meetings with our elected officials in this format?
You know, I think just it's been super helpful because, like I said, I'm a new director. Now going just under 2 years of being in my director role, but coming up through a peer-based organization, there isn't a lot of like people to show me, you know, so the TAC really was this really amazing liaison to do those like formal introductions to like kind of open the door and like bring us into the room. And so that was really awesome for me from like having to learn all this for the first time. So yeah, I think the liaising from the advisory committee, from the TAC was really amazing. And yeah, I mean, everything you just said, like for having that broken down made me have a more strategic approach to how to build those relationships and know what to ask for. So I think that was the most powerful part of it.
Thank you. And then Nicole's kind of building off of what Joaquin said in terms of strategy, how have you prepared strategically for these meetings with elected officials?
You know, thank you for the question, Pao. I think that it's very important to bring the living voices of the voiceless, because has been, as you mentioned, since when we have been walking through the slides, one of the needs were the lack of funding, the lack of investment of the city to our communities. So bringing our voices, you know, the living experience of us who represents the community, it's a way to awakening, you know, the attention of the official electors. So I think that is crucial as well to humanize the numbers, because my strategy has been that even in within my organization, I always said, we are more than the data. We are more than the numbers. We are human beings who have been survivors of the unimaginable experiences, even here in the sanctuary city of San Francisco. So coming with these humanized stories, it is the main strategy. It is the core, as you mentioned, of bringing together these needs with the focus of humanity, you know, bringing our voice, especially for those who have been marginalized even greater or more than you can imagine. So for me, that's a way to strategize, to always keep in mind that yes, the numbers are important. Yes, the data is important. Bringing our experience, living experiences are important, but especially bringing our whole humanity, because we are seeing our communities as a whole, that one needs comes from these other needs that make difficult to our communities to access of health, education, work, etc. Basically, to access of a dignity of life.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And I also see in the chat some really great comments. Somebody said that they love the phrase humanize the numbers. And then also Joaquin talking about that's the same strategy we have to decolonize the space and remind bureaucrats of their own humanity as well. Yeah, so thank you both for sharing. I think that is a really key piece of what we do with Advocacy Week. And then the other thing is, you know, elected officials are really busy. They're always hearing from constituents. They're probably burnt out like nonstop, because how could you not be to like have to deal with all that stress and like hearing from people who are upset with you all the time. And so I think it helps that we do a combination of like building really positive relationships, offering something that's really relatively easy for them to just say yes to versus like them having to do all the legwork. And then also really sharing those stories, right? Reminding them that it's not just about the numbers, it's not just about the data, but that it's like real people who are here in front of them and not only are here now, but will be back next year and the following year and the following year. And that also helps create accountability. Next slide, please. So we wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of what it looks like for us to prepare for our Trans Advocacy Week throughout the year. So like I said, we spend most of our year preparing for this 1 week in April in order to kind of meet with elected officials and advocate. However, there's still a lot of work that happens behind the scenes outside of that 1 week, right? So some of that work is working with our advisory committee to identify the priorities, compile the data, and develop the recommendations that we want to focus on. If there's a campaign that we want to do, then also develop that. So for example, our first year, we really, part of what was effective as our first year was we did a campaign with like a website and like talking about homelessness in San Francisco for trans people, and really like doing a lot of kind of outreach and social media, and being at our annual Trans March event to talk about this. So we created a lot of kind of focused like impetus and inspiration in the community around this one issue, and that helped create pressure for the elected officials. We don't always have to do a campaign anymore because they kind of know us and they know to expect us, and so we have already built up our kind of capital with them. But the first year, it was really helpful to go really big in order to make a point and be really effective. So then also, you know, as we get into Advocacy Week, there's a lot of logistics for us to figure out, like scheduling, making sure that our advisory committee members are feeling confident about how to speak to elected officials, making sure that everyone is on the same page around the recommendations, et cetera. And then we do Advocacy Week, and then we do a debrief and really try to make sure we're learning from what happened so that each year we can do better. And the other key thing that I want to share around this slide in terms of strategy is, you know, for us, the reason we have Advocacy Week in April is because it's aligned with how the San Francisco City budget decisions happen, so that elected officials still have the time and the space to make decisions around budget then and there. So For San Francisco, the mayor's office is starting to develop the city's budget starting in like December or so, and then through May. And so April is a good time for us to really like emphasize like we need this money for our communities. And the other benefit for us in this timing is that when the mayor and or the elected officials say yes to our proposals, then we can, it's also a benefit that June is right around the corner and they can then make those announcements in June, right? So part of what they get out of it is the legacy and really kind of showing that they're leaders for trans and LGBTQ issues. And so lining it up so that then in June, they can like make those statements is another incentive for them, to be honest. And then for our supervisors or our city council members, they have a section when they get to decide things about the budget that's later in June and July. So often, even though it's not formally part of Advocacy Week, the organizations represented by our advisory committee still advocate with those supervisors later on into June and July in order to make sure that if some aspects were not covered by the mayor's proposed budget, that the supervisors will consider what still is needed to supplement the budget. So the key thing is really just like, if you're going to ask for money, you need to make sure that you're timing it so that the elected officials have the ability at that moment in time to say yes. Because if it's not the right time and they don't have the ability to say yes, then they're not going to feel good about it. You're not going to feel good about it. And it's not going to be as effective as it could be. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the key lessons we've learned, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So you see on this slide some of the beautiful faces of our current and former advisory committee members. So one of the next slide, please. One of the first things we want to really emphasize is preparation is key. I know we've said this throughout, but it really does help us to have a schedule, to have an agenda for the meetings, for us to be organized. And we've heard that from elected officials multiple times. Like when we're in those meetings, we hear from elected officials, wow, you all are organized. And that makes an impression, right? It means that they know that we will be back next year and the following year. And it means that they know they will have to be accountable to us again. So really showing that is a really helpful tool. And one of the ways in which, especially the first year we showed that we were organized, was with our homelessness data brief, which is in the Google Drive folder for you to see. That was like a really beautiful document with like all these data points around trans people's experiences around housing and homelessness and shelters. And when we came in person with this like beautifully printed document with all these data points, they were like, wow, like this is really impressive. Like people have like, you know, organized and put this together and taken time to do this. And this looks really official, right? So not that that matters to me, whether we look official or not, but it matters to them. And that's what's really important, is identifying what matters to them, what's going to be kind of a way to really emphasize that we're ready and we're prepared. And then the other piece around that from our office has been making sure that the advisory committee members feel really prepared. So that looks like practicing public speaking, helping create talking points, developing background documents for them to learn about the city's budget process or learn about our elected officials. So for example, every year we update this document that we have about each elected official that we're meeting with, what are the issues that they care about, what district do they represent, et cetera. So preparation, super important. The last thing about this slide I'll say is, one thing that we did not think through, and this is why this is a lesson learned, is what happens after you get the yes. So in the first year, one big lesson for us was, we did all this advocacy. We got a yes to fund this new program called Our Trans Home, which Joaquin is now the director of. And then we were like, okay, well, now what? Like, now how do we make sure that this goes through and that the implementation happens? And we hadn't really thought about that, to be honest. We just were so focused on advocating that we didn't think through, like, what happens if we get a yes and how do we make it happen? And like, what does that look like? And we, for example, we did not really know, because our office was new, because this was the first time we had organized like this. We didn't really know what it looked like to get funds out to trans organizations to put something like this. Like, what are the bureaucratic steps that we need to go through with the city and county? What what are the rules basically around this? So we didn't know that. And then that led to some conflict between some of our trans organizations, right? And what we learned and what we have implemented since then is that after we get the yes, for us, it can be helpful to do a community input process where we get some input from our advisory committee members around some key aspects of the program design and key things that we want to use to kind of frame the program, even if we don't have the power to like fully design the program, because that's up to whatever organization eventually gets the funds. We do have the power to frame it kind of within certain parameters. And so we do that through a community input process at this point. But that's something we did not know the first year, and now we know. So that's why we're sharing it with you. So let's see the next slide, and I'm going to pass it over to Shane.
Hi again. So this is one of my favorite parts of the process, and Nicole really said it beautifully, to humanize the numbers. And that's what we want to do when we're talking to elected officials. At the end of the day, they're people, and we as trans people are having real experiences, and living here in San Francisco, living here myself personally, I've gone through a lot, like in terms of experiencing homelessness and meeting other trans people who are really deep in those experiences as well. And a lot of trans people, the reality is they come to San Francisco for different reasons. There's so many inequities that the trans community faces overall, whether it's that they're kicked out of their home at a young age because they identify as trans, whether it's they're unable to access education because of the way they're treated in those spaces, discrimination and transphobia just to get a job. These are experiences we know, but a lot of times elected officials might not have the scope of how that impacts a trans person's life daily, right? And how even when trying to access the services that exist, that there is constant fear or struggle associated with that because of past traumas. And so what we do with the story piece is to really have a conversation about how those experiences really influence the lives we get to have. And so for us, that was a really big focal point when we're sharing these stories. And yes, the reality is data helps as well. Because if they're just hearing one person, of course, we can humanize that. But the reality is when they realize that it's a bunch of people that are going through this in the city, and that there are ways to help either alleviate or stop that from happening with their help, with their yes. And so we've been able to share that through these different data briefs and through the different recommendations we've put together. And it's been extremely effective. So I want to use this time to make sure I address Nicole and Joaquin. You might have answered a little bit of this before, but I'll ask again, what are some examples of how you've shared stories in order to be effective during Trans Advocacy Week? I'll start with Joaquin.
Thanks, Shane. Yeah, we actually had a really powerful year this year when we met, because, I one of my major callings is what I've been through and what I've been able to do with my story, right? Like to have gone come to San Francisco because I was trans, to seek a place where I could access those resources. It's a very common story. So I was able to kind of share the narrative, the common narrative that happens when people are coming here as refugees of transphobia. And then another TAC member who is younger was able to kind of share how like those resources for him at a younger age meant that he could become an entrepreneur. So it was kind of like, here's what happens when we don't have our needs met, was my story. And then, you know, you get a later start in life, maybe in your 30s. And then here's what happens to a young person who is trans, now able to access a lot of opportunities that cis people get to access just inherently. And so it's just really good to like kind of join our stories together and share these like diverse kind of relational stories that are narratives in trans people's lives of like the different possibilities and the things that we're fighting to change and avoid, and what it looks like for someone like from my generation to reach back and see the impact that has on someone, a younger generation, and then also to be in that room with our elders so they can share the stories of what they went through for people of my generation to have what we have today. So I think that really like weaving those stories together was really powerful, and we could tell that it was very compelling to the supervisors. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Joaquin. I'll ask the same question to Nicole. Like, what are some examples of shared stories that you might have used in the Advocacy Week process to make that time effective?
Well, you know, for me, it's important to, as I mentioned before, you know, humanizing us, portraying us as the human beings that we are all. So one of the reasons that I think that it's super important to share our stories, you know, and that has been super helpful in this process, is to acknowledge that maybe we don't have the funds right now, or they are not investing in our needs, because simply they are cis persons in positions of powers that they don't know. And they don't even, they won't ever know what is the experience of a trans person, an intersex or gender diverse community. So coming with this acknowledge and with this compassion as well, you know, compassion both sides, you know, like it is not a confrontation. It is not a Olympics of suffering either. It is just the reality that they don't know. So coming with this acknowledgement, coming with this awareness, and coming with this compassion and with this generosity to create together a safer, a better, a just San Francisco and beyond borders, because the Trans Advisory Committee in this model that we are shaping together, it is not only a model from San Francisco, it is worldwide. There is not another TAC coalition that we are aware in the rest of the world. So coming with this generosity, making the elected officials being the first to address human rights issues, because at the end is that. It is the awareness that we are talking about human rights that has been denied to certain population and certain communities. And also coming with the awareness that you don't have to reopen your wounds. You don't have to reopen or re-victimize or re-traumatize in this process. So it is all an act of love that it is coming together in these strategies, in these you know, stories. But basically it's coming with that, you know, make people aware with our stories that these realities are happening in front of their noses, and we are presenting the opportunities to make it, those situations right. You know, so, and they have the power to make those decisions. They have the power if it is the lack of knowledge, the lack of experience, because they are cis persons. We are coming here, telling our stories, putting with our open vulnerability to speak the truth of our communities who have never been heard. Because one of the things that we learned in COVID as well It is that we have been attacked, or we have endured, and we have faced different pandemics, but pandemic of hatred, it is still very present. And that's the reality in our communities that are facing these unbelievable challenges. So coming firsthand, first story, you know, the people who knows I'm an immigrant because I had to flee my home country of origin to survive, coming to this country with the hope, you know, to survive in this country. And it's even here in a sanctuary city as San Francisco, we're still losing community members. We're still, you know, having people unhoused, people with no food, people with no work. So coming with these stories are crucial to save lives. And that's the opportunity that we give to elected officials. It is to save lives and do things right.
Thank you so much, Nicole and Joaquin. And it's so true, you know, like as much as we're trying to uplift the experience and make sure that they can hear us, the reality is it's lives at stake, right? And we try to remind them of that. We try to remind them that these are real lives that they can impact. And we really hope by sharing this that this can impact trans people everywhere, right? Even though San Francisco, we do have a large trans community, the reality is trans people are everywhere and should deserve and should be able to access the basic needs. And hopefully by organizing, we can make that possible. And we shared this with you today. Next slide, please. Thank you both again.
Thank you. And then one of the other kind of key lessons that we have learned in this process is the importance of being strategic, right? And we've talked a little bit about that already, but some key lessons have been finding the elected officials that are strong allies or are motivated to be strong allies or even perform strong allyship, right? Like, honestly, how they truly feel is not the most important thing. What's most important is, will they show up? Will they help us with the yes that we need? And then also being very honest, like, you know, you don't have to be honest with the elected officials directly, but like being honest within the team and within the organizers that you're working with when considering the perspectives of these elected officials. What is it that they want to get out of this? How can you get them to care, right? Some of it could be stories. Some of it could be their reputation. Some of it could be avoiding bad publicity. Some of it could be that they want this as an aspect of their legacy, right? They want to be able to say that they really helped.
Para poder decir
Oh, sorry.
que ellas sí pudieron ayudar.
We have the interpreter switched over for a second. Okay, I think we're back. So really being able to talk about, you know, their legacy and saying that they really did something significant for a community that experiences a lot of inequities. And one thing doesn't, like, it's not in conflict that they can either care deeply or just care superficially about our people. The reality is, like, whatever it takes to get them on board and for us to figure out strategies to get them on board, right? And then the last thing that's really important when negotiating budget, right? And this is the case in a lot of different settings, but in this case as well, is ask for more than what you need in terms of budget. Do not underestimate, always overestimate, or at the very least, really like determine what it is that you would need without making any kind of cuts or without really without just having the basics, because it will get cut, right? So for example, this year we advocated for, I believe it was 15 million to end trans homelessness in the first year, and then the second year was like 30 million or something like that. We knew that likely we would not get that full amount. However, it was still important for us to be able to say, we're prepared, we've put together a budget, we know how much it's going to cost. And in the context of the city's budget, which is about 12 billion, you know, 40 million is not the biggest thing. So that was part of our strategy and preparing for it and communicating to them that we were prepared and strategic. So with that, I want to just kind of ask Nicole and Joaquin one last question before we start wrapping up the session, which is, when you met with your district supervisor or city council member, or the supervisor of the district that is really important to your organization, what were the things that you focused on to really kind of make the case and get them on board to support our asks? And let's start with Nicole.
Thank you. I must say that I have an amazing district attorney. So I like, and also, the board of supervisor, the district supervisor that we have at Ella, she's amazing. So one of the things that I'm always coming when meeting with her, it is to have, a present that she is an ally, a present that we are working towards a better San Francisco and the mission in particular, that it is a traditional Black and Brown community, coming with the knowledge that we are creating, together, that we are learning together, and we are creating better ways to provide the support that our communities needs. And coming that it is not only a trans issue, it is not only a gender diverse issue, it is a human issue that affects all of us, all the broader community. So when coming with this, common points to talk with her has been always, very useful and very we have a lot of fruits coming from there, but it actually helps to have Supervisor Ronan on board as an ally, as an amazing human being. And it hasn't been that challenge to talk about human rights, basically. So thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. What about you, Joaquin?
Yeah, again, it was like a really big learning experience because so thanks to the advisory week, we got to meet with a lot of different supervisors, and our shelter is in one district, and then our house is in the mission in a different district, same as Ellis, I think, with Hillary Ronan. So it really found that like certain supervisors were very emotionally engaged, present, and compelled, and other supervisors were really burnt out and acted like just like they didn't care, honestly. So it was really interesting to kind of get to know them all in that sense, to see who really felt from our stories, like compelled, like a passion, like tears, anything like that, and just kind of try to think of a strategy that way a little bit more was one thing. But I did also find that a lot of times, like, we spent a lot of time preparing our stories and stuff, and then getting in the room with the supervisors, they were kind of like, we understand the plight of trans people, just tell us your numbers, and so that was a little bit like, I didn't really enjoy that experience, because it's like, here I am kind of telling you like my story, so if you already know, then I don't need to spell it out to you. That's a different strategy. So I'm just sharing that with people because it's something that I went through that I didn't really know what to expect. So yeah, it's possible that you may be preparing to really compel somebody who already knows the situation and already is really on board. In that case, I think just showing them how we're doing something different than that hasn't been done before, that's addressing a lot of the issues about what currently exists. Okay, so yes, there are shelters, but here's how ours is different. And here's where we're taking a different model. And they can, because then when they go and see all the different, whatever resources, they're gonna see what stands out about a model that hasn't been done before. So I think that's one thing it's more about inspiring people to believe that different things can happen, and investing in newer causes can mean change. Because I think a lot of times too in the advocacy scene, I found that people were like, oh yeah, well, we are normally give money to these organizations because they've been around for many years. And I had to kind of engage them to say like, well, just because organizations have been around for many years doesn't mean that, you know, our cause has not always existed. And just because it has never been supported before means that actually maybe you should see how the impact in having this now is like something you should invest in more than just because it has a long history, you know, not because it's newer and smaller. So that was another thing I learned strategically a little bit about getting in the rooms with the supervisors, is getting them to understand, you know, whether if your cause is like newer or smaller, the kind of equity pieces behind like why they should be investing in your cause. So there's a couple other things. And then, you know, there's always personalities. So if someone, you know, someone you find like you can get them laughing, that's a good way to go. You know, if someone is more like serious, just kind of like, yeah, like building those relationships was a big thing. But as far as for our cause, I think just weaving the story, right? Like one thing leads to the next. If you can't get a job, you can't pay your rent. So then you know, again, how easy it is to go from being a client to a provider for people that are in our community. You know, like I have staff now that if they lose their job, they're going to be applying to the resources, you know, they're going to be applying to the program. So I think just really being able to break down to the supervisors the ways that them investing in our program is gonna like stop a domino effect from like more services needing to be provided in the long run. Because they're always kind of trying to think of like, okay, if I put my money here, I don't want to have to come back and think like, did you not spend that money? You know, was this not needed? And that there's a lot of like that, I think that they get kind of like irritated with sometimes, where they're like, well, so why are we having, you know, so you really want to show them that, like Pao said, all of that is going to go to good use, you know, they're beyond, and then you're going to come back for more. And then make sure that you follow through on that. So I know I answered a lot of different questions, but just trying to share the things I really learned this year from advocacy season. So, but it was good.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think, you know, both of you really touched on different aspects of part of this is educating our elected officials, not just about our experiences, but also the broader equity issues that are at play for our communities and the organizations that we have for our communities, right? Our organizations tend to be smaller, tend to be funded less, tend to be less financially stable. And those are all things that play into this entire dynamic, and we have to often educate the elected officials about that. Let's move on to the next slide.
So one of the things mentioned is like relationships matter, right? Like, and I think the most important one to develop if you decide to take this on is the relationship of the people who you will work with directly in order to push this advocacy, right? On top of the people who are incredible leaders, these are people you're going to work closely with. These are people you're going to see a lot of vulnerability with, because these stories, they're not just, you know, something off of the page. These are lived experiences, and sometimes these are personal lived experiences, right? We've been in the room of hearing each other's really hardships, right? And I think with that being said, we've had to get to know each other in a way that really grounds us in the work we're about to do, because sometimes it's not easy. Sometimes it's not easy to come to an elected official and try to present why this matters, you know? So when you build a team that really supports you, that supports each other, you're able to build that trust. You're able to sort of discuss the real problems. You're able to find ways to support each other within the negotiation process of this advocacy. So I think it's so important that you really build that relationship with the team that you decide to take this sort of advocacy with on. And then also developing relationships with the people you're speaking with. The reality is you'll see them again, especially if they're elected officials. And with San Francisco, the reality is this city is smaller than you think. I wouldn't be surprised if I bumped into Joaquin this week, because it's happened already. You know, it's a small city here at least, you know, and that's the kind of thing with community. When you're with community, you can really utilize the times that you're together to build that strategy, but also bring in elected officials into community, right? Like if you saw the last slide, that was the mayor at Trans March announcing the passing of our trans home, right? So bringing them into community as well in order to build relationships, in order to see the impact, you know, that what we're advocating for doesn't just happen at that meeting table, but also that it's really impacting the lives of people who they get to see here today, you know? So really important just to focus on building that trust and human bond with the people you're working with and the people you're speaking to. Thank you so much. And next slide, please.
So in summary, we wanted to share with you our strategy, what has worked for us in San Francisco. And, you know, the reality is that if you decide to do this in your own community, it will likely look different because you have a different community there. You have different elected officials, you have different dynamics at play. And so we really want to share kind of our lessons learned so that if you decide to do this, you can learn from what we've been able to do, but ultimately you're the experts of what will be most effective in your own community. And so really making sure that you're relying on that local expertise from organizers and community members wherever you want to do this is going to be the most important thing. So with that, let's go on to the next slide and we will take any questions for the last couple minutes that we have. If anyone has questions. And if not, you can just look at our beautiful faces and that's okay too.
Folks should be able to unmute themselves if anyone does have any questions or comments or anything that they'd like to say to the panel.
Thank you, Danny. Yeah. Daniel?
Hey, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the conversations. I really appreciate your input. I'm calling on with Blue Shield of California, and a lot of the work we're doing now is how do we hear from you all in terms of what we need to do, how to make this sustainable, how to make your work sustainable, and how do we support you in these efforts, because the health of our transgender community is important and for many years hasn't been prioritized. So, you know, I was hoping to hear from you all, you know, what does a seat at the table with health plans look like as well?
Yeah, so I'll take a stab at answering that. I think with health plans, we know that there's a lot of issues around policies that are still gatekeeping access to healthcare for trans people. So I think that's a really important piece. I also think that for organizations in the private sector who might be able to you know, provide funding and donate to some of the organizations that are doing work that may not be healthcare explicitly, but as we know, housing is healthcare, and we know that access to safety is healthcare. So just really acknowledging, I think, the social determinants of health is also really important.
Pal, those are great points, and I think that's what we're also trying to look into is how do we support housing, how do we increase you know, community health workers in the transgender community to connect individuals to social services, and I wonder, you know, ultimately making it sustainable. How do we make sure that organizations like ELEA are part of the healthcare system and not just a clinic, right? That the healthcare of our transgender community, of our BIPOC communities does not stay within the four walls of a health center, which is an important part of the ecosystem of health, but not the only piece.
Totally, and I see Joaquin has hand up. Do you want to answer?
Shane, you had your hand first. You want to go first?
I just want to quickly say, like, in terms of like what we've talked about today is, you can always create a seat at the table, right? Like, we're encouraging people to bring a seat, but if you have the power to create space and have somebody to come in and really talk about these issues in a way that you can on a larger scale impact, set up those meetings, call in somebody to come in and really talk about the lived experience and also the work that's being done with these orgs, and make it something that happens regularly, right? It's not a one-time thing. These are ongoing conversations of how you can make systemic change that impact the lives of trans people. So I would say, something to take away from this is not just encouraging people to make their own seat, but providing a seat for trans people to be able to speak on those experiences.
Thank you, Shane. Joaquin, do you want to give a really quick response? Because I know we're at time.
For sure. Yeah, and if you want to reach out to me, I'll put my email in the chat so we can talk more about it. But basically, kind of what Shane said, it needs to be by and for. So finding ways to give opportunities to trans people to serve their community, because society is just too far away from understanding how to provide competent services to trans people without trans people being there. Yeah, and I'm happy to collaborate with you to kind of let you know what we're doing right now, because we have a shelter in a house where like 60 to 80 trans people live who have extreme health concerns because they are unhoused. So we are working with other, with Line Martin Health Services on things like this. But we always take matters into our own hands until folks are able to, like Shane said, consistently meet with us to figure out how to change the narrative.
Thank you all. So I know that we're at time, and I saw that Danny put in the chat that we will be rejoining the general session to do a quick activity before starting lunch break. So thank you so much. Danny, did you want to make any last comments before we wrap up?
Thank you to the entire team for taking the time to present here at this conference. I know you all are so busy with the amazing work that you're doing in the Bay Area. So just thank you so much. And to everyone else, thank you so much for participating, and we will see you in the main room. So thank you so much.
Thank you.